Okay, so new parent. You've got this brand new human in your life.
Congratulations.
Congrats. But let's be real. This first 3 months, intense is an understatement.
Yeah.
So today we're taking a deep dive into a popular Spanish language podcast
Okay.
all about those early days, because it turns out even across languages when it comes to newborns,
Right.
we're all speaking the same sleep-deprived language.
Exactly. And this podcast highlights a concept I find fascinating.
Okay.
The fourth trimester.
Okay.
It's the idea that those first 3 months after birth aren't a clean break from the womb.
Interesting.
Your baby's still adjusting.
Right.
Think underdeveloped digestive systems,
Okay.
which explains a constant feeding.
Oh, right.
Or that adorable startle reflex, a leftover survival mechanism from their time in the womb.
Wow, leftover survival mechanisms. I never thought about it like that.
Yep.
So it's not just that they're getting used to a new environment.
Right.
Their little bodies are literally still catching up.
Precisely. And this is happening across the board.
Right.
Their nervous systems, their respiratory systems. It's a period of incredibly rapid development.
Wow.
Every interaction, from feeding to those quiet cuddles,
Yeah.
plays a role.
That makes those seemingly endless feeding sessions feel a bit more meaningful, right? Speaking of which, this podcast is a huge advocate for breastfeeding.
And for good reason.
Yeah.
One of the things they emphasized was the unique composition of breast milk.
Right.
It's not just about the nutrients.
Okay.
It's the antibodies, the way it changes over time.
Wow.
Even within a single feeding.
Really?
From colostrum to foremilk to hindmilk.
Okay.
Each offering specific benefits to the baby.
Okay, so I've heard of colostrum. That's the liquid gold right after birth.
Right.
But foremilk and hindmilk.
Yeah.
Tell me more about those.
Well, think of it like this. Foremilk is what your baby gets at the beginning of a feed.
Okay.
It's thinner, quenches their thirst, and is higher in lactose, which provides energy.
Got it.
As the feeding goes on, they start to get the hindmilk, which is richer in fat and calories, helping them feel full and satisfied.
Wow, so much happening in just one feeding.
Right.
It really highlights how perfectly tailored breast milk is for a baby's needs.
Yeah.
But the podcast also acknowledged that it's not always possible or the right choice for every parent,
Sure.
and that's okay.
Absolutely. Formula feeding has come a long way, and the most important thing is that you as a parent feel supported in your choices.
Of course.
Whether you're breastfeeding, formula feeding, or a combination of both, the key takeaway is that those frequent feeds are crucial for your baby's development.
Okay.
Yeah.
Speaking of frequenting, the podcast had a detail that new parents might want to brace themselves for.
Okay.
Those feedings, they can happen every 2 to 3 hours around the clock.
It's true.
Oh my gosh.
Newborns have tiny tummies
Right.
and a rapid rate of growth.
Okay.
So those frequent feeds are their way of getting all the calories and nutrients they need to thrive.
Makes sense.
And this actually ties back to the whole fourth trimester concept.
Yeah.
Their digestive systems are still developing.
Right.
So they process breast milk and formula differently than older babies.
So that's why they seem to be hungry all the time. It's not just me imagining it.
Not at all. It's completely normal for newborns to feed frequently, and it's important to respond to their cues and feed them on demand.
Got it.
But this also means that getting a full night's sleep might feel like a distant dream for a while.
Which brings us naturally to the topic of sleep, or the lack thereof.
Right.
Babies, as we know, are masters of sleeping in short bursts.
Yes.
Tell me if this podcast has some magic tips for getting those little ones to sleep through the night.
I hate to disappoint, but there's no magic button for that, I'm afraid.
Darn.
One fascinating point the podcast made, though, is that those short bursts of sleep, as frustrating as they can be for us, are actually crucial for their development.
Really?
Yeah, their brains are growing at an incredible pace during this time, and sleep plays a vital role in that.
So even though it might feel like they're doing nothing but eating, pooping, and sleeping,
Yeah.
in short bursts, of course.
There's a lot happening behind the scenes.
Absolutely. And those sleep bursts are also when their bodies are doing a lot of growing.
Interesting.
They highlighted the importance of creating a calm, dark, and quiet environment for sleep.
Okay.
Think back to the womb again.
Makes sense. So no bright lights or loud noises. Got it.
Right.
And what about those pre-sleep routines I hear so much about?
That's where things get interesting. The podcast suggested that while you can't impose a strict sleep schedule on a newborn,
Right.
now's the perfect time to start building those positive sleep associations.
So things like rocking, singing, maybe a warm bath before bed,
Yeah.
like building blocks for good sleep habits down the road.
Exactly. You're not necessarily aiming for them to fall asleep during these routines, but rather to start associating those calming activities with bedtime.
I see.
Now, speaking of routines, let's talk about another one that often sparks a lot of questions. Bath time.
Bath time. I have to admit, as a non-parent, I always pictured it as this adorable, photo-worthy experience.
Right. But I'm guessing the reality is a little more slippery.
Let's just say it's definitely a sensory experience,
Yeah,
both for the baby and the parent.
I bet.
But you're right, it's about more than just getting clean.
Okay.
This podcast actually highlighted how important bath time can be for bonding
Okay.
and creating a calming experience for your little one.
That makes sense. It's like a mini spa day for those teeny humans.
Right.
Warm water, gentle touch.
Yeah.
But speaking of keeping things clean, this podcast surprised me.
Okay.
They said, you don't need to bathe a newborn every day.
I know, right?
Really?
Seems counterintuitive with those frequent diaper blowouts.
Yeah.
But the podcast made a good point.
Okay.
Bathing too frequently can actually dry out their delicate skin.
Makes sense. Their skin is still getting used to life outside the womb.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So what do they recommend a couple of times a week?
Exactly. 2 to 3 times a week is sufficient.
Got it. Prioritize those diaper changes. And speaking of which, this podcast really emphasized how sensitive a newborn's skin is.
Yeah.
Especially in that diaper region.
Absolutely. They made a point of recommending baby-specific products, which I thought was a great actionable takeaway for new parents.
Yeah.
Those gentle formulas are designed specifically for a newborn's delicate skin.
Yeah, no harsh chemicals for those little tushies. So frequent diaper changes, gentle products. Any other tips for preventing diaper rash?
One interesting tip they mentioned was allowing for some diaper-free time.
Really? Like just let them air dry?
Precisely.
Wow.
Even just a few minutes here and there can make a big difference in terms of air circulation and promoting skin health.
Got it.
And speaking of promoting health and well-being, let's move on to something I know you're going to love.
Cuddles.
Okay, cuddles I can get behind. But this podcast took it beyond just a feel-good activity.
Right.
They were really emphasizing how important physical touch is, especially in those first few months.
What I found fascinating was the science behind it.
It's not just about providing comfort and security, although that's certainly a huge part of it.
There's actual science behind those cuddles.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Physical touch, especially skin-to-skin contact, helps regulate a newborn's body temperature, heart rate, even their breathing.
Wow.
And speaking of skin-to-skin, this podcast actually used the term kangaroo care interchangeably.
Kangaroo care. I've heard of that. Isn't that where you hold your baby like directly against your skin?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's incredible for premature babies, but it's beneficial for all newborns.
Okay.
And it's not just about the physical benefits. It strengthens that emotional bond and even helps regulate their sleep-wake cycles.
Wow, those cuddles are like a superpower.
Right.
So for all those new parents out there who feel like their baby wants to be held all the time, it's not just in your head, it's science.
Precisely. And the podcast really drove that point home, emphasizing that wanting to be held all the time is not only normal,
Okay.
it's a biological need at this stage.
So embrace those cuddles, folks. They're basically tiny little growth spurts waiting to happen. Right.
Now, we've talked about feeding, sleep baths, diaper changes, cuddles,
Right.
all incredibly important, but also it seems like a lot to juggle.
Sure.
What about routines? Is it even possible to establish a routine with a newborn who seems to operate on their own chaotic schedule?
That's a great question, and the podcast actually addressed that directly.
Okay.
They acknowledge that rigid schedules are pretty much impossible in those first few months.
Right.
Babies are still figuring out this whole being alive thing, right?
Totally. So what's the alternative? Just go with the flow and hope for the best.
It's less about imposing a strict timetable and more about recognizing your baby's natural rhythms and cues.
Okay.
This podcast had some great tips for recognizing those cues.
Like what kind of cues?
Well, for example, are there certain times of day when your baby seems fussier or hungrier?
Oh.
Do they seem more content after a feed or a nap?
So it's less about sticking to a rigid schedule and more about paying attention and noticing patterns. Exactly. It's about finding those little pockets of predictability in the beautiful chaos that is newborn life.
Right.
The podcast even suggested keeping a little log of your baby's feeding, sleep, and diaper changes.
Okay.
Not to stress about it,
Right.
but just to start noticing those natural rhythms.
That's actually a really good idea. I bet you start picking up on things you wouldn't even realize otherwise.
Right. And once you start to see those patterns,
Yeah.
you can begin to gently build a loose routine around them.
Okay.
Maybe your baby tends to be fussier in the evenings. That could be your cue for a warm bath and some extra cuddles.
Okay.
Or maybe they always seem to have a good nap after a feeding chat. those are the moments you can start to capitalize on.
It's like meeting your baby where they are rather than trying to force them into a box.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of this stage. It's all about learning and adapting together.
Right.
What works one day might not work the next, and that's okay. Flexibility is key.
Speaking of flexibility, I think we've given our listener a lot to be flexible with today.
Yes.
From those round-the-clock feedings to the importance of skin-to-skin contact, we've really covered a lot of ground.
We really have. And yet we've only just scratched the surface.
Right.
This podcast, like any good resource, is a starting point, not the whole encyclopedia.
Exactly. Think of this deep dive as your crash course, your need-to-know guide for navigating those early days.
Because as you navigate those first 3 months and beyond, you're going to discover a whole universe of information about your baby
Right.
and about yourself as a parent.
I bet.
It's a journey of constant learning and discovery.
So to our listener out there embarking on this incredible journey, congrats again. Remember, you've got this.
You do.
And as you're figuring it all out, here's a thought to ponder. What surprised you most about those early days with your newborn?
Yeah.
What did you learn that you weren't expecting?
Because as much as we try to prepare those little ones, always have a way of surprising us.
And those surprises, more often than not, are what make the journey so incredibly rewarding.